Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to give a minute and let people trickle in to the session, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Today is the day of finding funding. So we're going to talk about grant research and grant tracking and how to find those pots of money for the projects that you are trying to accomplish for your organization. Just a couple reminders to stay muted when you're not speaking. Please keep your camera on so we can see your smiling faces when you can, and make sure you have something to take notes for the exercises as in past sessions. Also, just a review of the group norms. I know I skipped the question asking. We're going to start the question asking in a minute because we have a special guest today. We have our group norms so that we make sure that we're all in a good learning space. And remember that because our session is only 2 hours today, we don't have a scheduled break, but please take care of your needs. Okay, today we are pleased to have with us Kristen Monahan from Kelly Nonprofit Consulting. I know a lot of you have already engaged with her as a result of filling out the interest survey or other conversations that have taken place as a result of her involvement in this program, which we certainly appreciate. Kristen, I want to give you an opportunity to say hi and talk about what you've been seeing so far in terms of people signing up for one-on-one mentoring and shorter sessions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks for letting me crash the fun, crash the party. This group is, we had the fastest signups we've ever had for a session. I was telling Jennifer, I'm not sure what she put in her email, but we had like within a matter of just a few hours, all the slots were taken. So that's for the full kind of one-on-one where we do the 8 to 10 hours of one-on-one. However, I will say that usually for every session, there's 1 or 2, sometimes 3 groups that don't end up needing, for whatever reason, don't end up needing their full hours. So if we have leftover hours that we can cobble together another open slot or 2, we certainly will. So we will let the RDI team know, and they can send an email out if there's others that want to sign up, or maybe you can send an email if you want to be added to that kind of waiting list. And then we also have a new link, and I'm not sure if it's been shared yet, but we have a new link that will take you to a form specific for like 30-minute questions and calls times. So for that form, and it's just to help us stay organized. If you have trouble with the form, you can also just feel free to write me or Jennifer directly too. But the form has an opportunity for you to, if you know your question and you feel like you can write it out, great. You don't have to, but it just could help us maximize our time together. There's also an opportunity for you to upload things. So if it's like you want to have a proposal you want us to take a peek at, or an RFP you want us to help, try to determine if it's a good fit for you, things like that. Any homework you want to give us in advance of our 30-minute call, please feel free to do that. But it's a separate link because it has a little bit of fewer questions since it's our shorter time with you. So we haven't fully dove in with the folks who have signed up for one-on-one because we just got them scheduled last week. So my team has been reaching out to everyone to get times on the book. So hopefully most if not all of you have been contacted. If you haven't, you will be this week to get something scheduled. And then, but in the past sessions, it has run full gamut. We have done everything from edited or wrote new copy for a federal proposal, helped reviewed federal RFPs, helped create an organizational budget for the first time, create program budgets, developed new copy for either a new program or a new initiative, help with partnership planning, help develop an MOU between the partners that we're going in on a grant together, help looking at if you have a list of funders you think are a good fit for your program or your organization. We work with funders directly, many of them through a lot of different initiatives. We can, we submit 40, 80 proposals a month times, we've started in 2006, so we have a pretty good idea of who funds what and when and how much. So we could also take a quick look at or we have taken looks at what folks have planned to say sort of what's realistic, or give some kind of insider knowledge on what funders, what kind of trends are happening. Making edits to existing proposals is something that also that we've done a lot of, and also just answering questions. I think that there's so often we get questions and of organizations that think they're sort of bashful about, oh, we don't have this figured out, or we don't have this all the way solidified yet. And the truth is, no one has it all figured out. No one has it all together. And so just providing some reassurance and providing some next steps and tips for how to get on track for whatever aspect that year that's presenting a barrier for you for funding. So we're really excited to be part of this program. It's been so great partnering with RDI all these years, and it's been such an honor to get to know a little bit more about really incredible programs and organizations across the state and beyond. So our team, we're a team of 15. We are in Oregon and in Washington as well. And we're about equally urban and rural based.
Thanks, Kristen. As you can all tell, if you haven't figured it out already, Kristen's organization is a tremendous value to this course. And if you do have a specific problem you're trying to work through, I encourage you to connect with them. We will send out the new link for the 30 to 60 minute sessions after this, so that you have that in case there's something that you just want to pick their brains about. So I will ask right now if there are any questions for Kristen, either about the process by which you can take advantage of her great services, or just a question about grants or fundraising or nonprofits in general that you're curious about.
I've been looking for a link to sign up to meet with Kristen, but I can't seem to find a way to do that.
Connie, I've been sending emails before and after each session. Are you getting those?
Yes.
Okay, there's one of the options. There should be in those emails is where I've been putting the link. So, but if you're still having trouble, please reach out to me directly and I will reply to you directly. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else have a question? I will go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that there's also over the last couple of years, there's just so much in terms of like fund readiness or grant readiness that we support as well. So it might not be that you have an application ready for review. It might be that you're having an issue with your board and your executive directors, or you may have an issue or question about branding, or a question about other impact, measurement, other things that you may feel, is this really related, or it can, but if it's a barrier, and there's so much that goes into making a strong proposal and a strong organization, it's much beyond the application itself. So just wanted to say that in case you have something you're not sure is a right fit for it. It probably is, but we can certainly let you know if it is or isn't. So please do reach out.
Great. We did have one question from last time that I wanted to bring forward, and I know Beth and I talked about this a little bit, but one of the, when we were talking about in-kind contributions, one of the questions that came up is if your board has a policy, or your the state or federal funding that you're receiving has a requirement for bids, and you receive a contribution from an organization that otherwise may have bid, that's an in-kind contribution. Wondering how you would answer that question, or how you would handle that.
Yeah, it's unfortunately not going to be an easy sort of like one size fits all answer to this one, because it depends on a lot of things, like the timing. So if there's an organization that provided in-kind services, say before you received federal funding for the project, then that doesn't count. If the funding that you received is not going directly towards these services, or the services happen before you receive funding that requires a bid process, then that doesn't matter. If or doesn't, you don't need to account for that. If you have a board policy, then that's a matter of connecting with your board and seeing if that policy can be amended or changed or altered depending on the value of the donation. So it might be something that your board has some flexibility on. If you are receiving federal, state funds, and even some foundation funds, just really looking through that contract and seeing what requirements there are, and reaching out to them to ask too about, does this particular scenario fall under our contract based on, you know, a variety of factors. It also depends on if the individual ultimately, are they providing an in-kind service and then they're bidding, or are they or is it part of their bid? Because we'll see a lot of times where if they have not yet provided that service, for anyone that's that's replying to RFP, to put whatever in kind they were going to provide as part of their proposed cost. So it would be like, you know, shown as a discount or shown as a potential in kind. So then it's fair, it's through the bidding process, and you can choose to consider that as part of the overall decision making for procurement too. So
Yeah.
it's complicated, but yeah, if you have specific questions, I can certainly work through it and look at the contract for you and see what you may or may not be able to do.
That makes sense. And I appreciate you bringing up the specter of, you know, the relationship aspect of it, where it is okay just to call and ask.
Totally. Yeah.
Most certainly. So I'm glad you said that. Any other burning questions for Kristen before we let her get on with her day? Okay. Well, we can always ask later. Going once, going. Okay. Kristen, thanks so much. I appreciate you the opportunity for you to join us and talk about the great services that you provide. And I'm sure a lot of the folks in the call today are looking forward to spending more time with you.
Yeah, as am I. Thanks for having me, and have a great session today. And I'll talk to many of you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Kristen.
Take good care. You bet. Bye now.
Bye. All right. Moving right along. What we're going to cover today, as I mentioned earlier, is the different types of funders that are out there, how you can go about doing funder research to find particular funders that fit what you're trying to do. And then we're going to talk a lot during the last part of the session today about relationships with funders, relationships with potential partners, and how to manage and build those. One of the thing I will say is, if you worked on your project budget or your organization budget that we had, the exercises that we did during the last session, and you've been identified to sort of, if you've been able to identify some sort of clear gaps, like I know I need funding for $10,000 for X, then that information will probably help, you know, inform the research that you're going to do during the session today. So that would be good information to have in your brain. If not, we're just going to provide a general overview of how to do this, and you'll be fine either way. I will say that when we talk about finding funders in rural places, that I would say a lot of it is word of mouth. And so we welcome any information you all want to put in the chat or say during the small group discussions today about funders that you're aware of, that the other people in the session might not have heard of or might be a good fit. So this is definitely today a session where we trade what we would call leads for funders. So please, I encourage you to share things as you think of them. So first, let's talk about the different types of funders that are out there. I will say that this is a very handout-rich session today. So if you have those available to you, it might be helpful to follow along, because I don't plan to read them word for word, because that sounds really like a lot. So the first handout we have is a different types of grants that are available to you. This is the first half of the page. The second half of the page is on the next slide. This just explains that, as we have already discussed, there are government grants and then there are foundation grants. Government grants are often federal, but sometimes local and state as well. The federal grant process can be usually for are usually high dollar grants, and they're usually fairly complex applications. So I would not, as we discussed before, recommend maybe starting with a federal grant if you've never written one before. It's something to work up to. But if you do have some federal sources that you're aware of, make sure that you're getting started with your registration in the federal SAM, or System for Award Management System. And that's something that Kristen could definitely help you with if you need help. We do also have state agencies. I know, for example, RDI receives a significant amount of funding from Business Oregon for our rural entrepreneurship and economic development work. There's also an example on the screen you see here of the Oregon Youth Development Council. Particularly in rural areas, we see that it's more likely that you're engaging with state government than federal government. It's not exclusively so, but because a lot of federal money passes through states, that's often the way that you'll see the grant application or the grant opportunity come through is from state government. Some local cities and counties also have buckets of money that you can apply for. This is less common pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic, what we're seeing is the American Rescue Plan dollars and other pots of money like that were being re-granted within a community. So there might still be some opportunities to do that at the local level. Then we have the specter of foundations. We have public foundations and private foundations. The distinction between public and private foundations is somewhat squishy, but essentially consider the amount of input they get from the public to make their decisions. So the Oregon Community Foundation is the best example of a public foundation in Oregon. They have groups of local leadership councils that help inform the kinds of grants that they're making. United Way is another national example that you're all familiar with, where they make a concerted effort to pull in a lot of community and regional opinions before making decisions about what to fund. And then on the private foundation side, we have a couple of different types. We have your basic family foundation. These are usually smaller. These are usually one family or one individual that has a specific way they want to disperse their charitable giving. And so they set up a foundation as an instrument for that. A corporate foundation is, so one thing I should say about corporate foundations, and I think I might have already mentioned this before, but I'm going to say it again, is they usually have two buckets of money. They have a corporate foundation that gives larger gifts that are in line with some of their social interests or community priorities. And then they'll also have like a sponsorship fund, which is smaller gifts. It's like if you want to have a sponsor for an art exhibit or for a special event that you're having in your downtown or something like that. That's usually a much more streamlined process and easier to get that money, where the corporate foundation is going to look a lot more like a regular foundation proposal that you would see from a private or public foundation. So another thing I want to mention about this handout is usually grants from government go to governments. So usually the people who are applying for federal grants or state grants are local governments, or the people who are applying for federal grants are state governments. That's not a universal truth. RDI has a significant amount of federal and state funding, but it tends to run that way. So when you look at who the eligible applicants are for a particular government grant, it may or may not include nonprofits. Also, foundation funding typically tends to flow to nonprofits, but not always. Sometimes they allow schools to apply or local governments to apply as well. So, but you just have to make sure that you look at that as part of your research for a particular funder, is what types of organizations do they fund. Okay. This particular handout is just a little bit deeper dive into the difference between foundations and corporate funders. I think I mentioned this already, but I will say again that in the case of corporate foundations, they are typically doing this not only because they think you're a super cool organization that does good work, but also because they are interested in getting their name out in the community as a supporter of yours. So really think carefully about how you're going to recognize their contribution to your organization or your program. And then in rural places, let's just have a moment where we talk about the fact that we don't necessarily in our communities have a lot of large corporations, right? So this isn't necessarily, this is something we're going to have to be a little bit more creative and think outside of the box. So for example, what businesses do you have in your community that have a national presence? Do you have a Walmart? Do you have a Fred Meyer? Does Pacific Power serve your region? They have a really good foundation that funds you. So think about public utilities. Banks are great. Banks usually, and any of these type of entities are going to require some kind of a local relationship. So it doesn't have to go to the extreme where you like have somebody sitting on your board who is the branch manager of the local bank, but if you bank at if you bank at Banner Bank or Umpqua Bank or what have you, it's a good way to have an opportunity to apply for their corporate giving fund, if that makes sense. The fact that you're a customer means a lot. So think about the connections you have in your community to different corporations, different banks, different other employers. The local hospital usually has a foundation, so that's something to think about. Tribes in your local community will have a foundation. Those aren't corporate, but it's just I guess think about the local connections that you have. Okay. Any questions before I move on about the different types of funders, foundations, government, corporate funders?
Comment in the chat just mentioning about corporate relations and connecting via local chambers of commerce.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and having employees volunteer at your events, that's really good too. So I think that on a lot of the bank applications, they will even ask that question. Are there opportunities for our staff to volunteer at your event or as part of your program? So at RDI, we have a program where we teach people whose first language is Spanish how to start a childcare business. And as part of that, we introduce them to, basic banking practices. And so if the local branch where we're providing our program happens to have someone who works there who speaks Spanish, we will usually invite them to be a guest speaker. That's just one example. Anything else? Okay, moving along in the parade of handouts. So as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to finding funders, there are some tools I can provide to you, but as a longtime fundraising human, what I will tell you is that you should just get in the habit of listening for leads or looking for leads. So these tools will get you part of the way. But if let's say you walk into the local Boys and Girls Club and they have a donor board in their entryway, I am a sucker for reading donor boards. I want to see what foundations are on there. If I see a foundation I haven't heard before, I'll put it in my phone and research it later. If you are out in the community, like at a Chamber of Commerce meeting or another, or in your, whatever community groups that you're a part of, if you hear of people receiving funding and you ask them more questions about how they went about it or how they made the connection or et cetera, et cetera. So there's a little bit of networking and a little bit of listening for clues involved in researching grants. That's more art than science, if you get my drift. But what we have provided you is a handout of research resources, and Kelly Nonprofit Consulting created this list. It's essentially some free websites and some websites that have subscriptions that will allow you to do some grant funding research on the particular topic or region that you're looking at. What I will say is probably the gold standard here is the Foundation Center. They probably have the most comprehensive database on that research resource list. I think that there's been a lot of mergers lately. I think they're part of Candid now. But that is probably also the more expensive resource on that list. If you don't have the resources, which many of us don't, to subscribe to the Foundation Center database, what I would recommend that you do is check with your local library. Sometimes they will purchase that subscription for the benefit of all the nonprofits in your region. And if they do not have a subscription, it might be something that you could ask about on behalf of, the nonprofits in your community to say, a bunch of us could really use this resource. Would you consider a subscription? I think last time I checked, it was like 50 or 60 bucks a month, but I'm not sure what it is now. So that's a list of tools that you have. I will say that sometimes looking at research databases can be a little bit discouraging because the primary way to rule out a funder who might want to give to your project or your organization is geography. If you're looking at a funder's website and the first thing I look for is where do they fund? Do they fund in Oregon? Do they fund in Idaho? If they don't, do they fund in Washington? If they don't, then I have to obviously rule that out because that's where we work. And a lot of foundations have a tendency to be urban based. So the statistic that we often quote here at RDI is that while rural represents 20% of the national population, philanthropic giving in rural is only 7%. So there's a gap there. And that's one of our, missions in life as an organization, is to try to do something about that. But I think that's why I'm recommending to you that you think more about looking at donor boards, talking to local people in your community, and find out where people are getting funding from, because sometimes it can be discouraging to look through national databases. You're like, nobody cares about my town because they fund other places or they fund in urban. The other thing I've provided is a funder vetting checklist. This is some, as you're doing research about a particular source of funding, the questions you need to ask. So like I said, number one for me is always geography. And number two is to look at the types of things they fund. In other words, if they are funding the arts, it's probably not a good fit for RDI because we don't have any programs in the arts. So I'll probably refer that to someone else I know who does work in that particular sector. So if you get beyond geography and their giving priorities and you still think you're a good fit, then this is probably worth a deeper dive. And you can look through the other questions on this checklist to see things like where, what is the grant range? What types of organizations do they give to? And dive in to see if how much it's clicking with what you want to do. We've also provided you with a really basic funding log. So what I would say is, do you remember when we talked about creating your organization budget and then creating your project budget and identifying where the gaps are and creating a plan of action? So for 2023, I know I need $50,000. I need these, I'm going to look at these 6 different sources for that $50,000. This is when their grant deadlines are. This is who's going to write the application. These are the things, I need to have letters of support for this particular application. All those details, creating some kind of a log or a grant calendar, it's also sometimes called, is a really helpful way to organize your life and make sure that you don't miss any deadlines. I will tell you, a lot of people have asked in past classes about tools that are available to do this. There's Donor Perfect, for example, you may have heard of, which is a software tool that you can use not only to track grantors, but also to track donors. I talked to Kristen last time to find out what she's recommending these days. And a lot of nonprofits are using something called Little Green Light. Kristen says it's not perfect. Frankly, they all have their flaws, but she said for the cost and functionality, that's what she recommends. I will tell you, for my entire life as a grant writer, I've always just used an Excel spreadsheet. And it works just fine, even though Freya is trying to get me to get a little bit more sophisticated, and we're now using an Airtable database. So go Freya. At any rate, there are a lot of opportunities out there, but I will say that I would encourage you to keep track, to develop some kind of a tracking system for your land proposal writing adventure in 2023, or however that timeframe looks for you. The last thing I will say that we used to do in the olden days is a funding master list, where we used to keep track of all of the funders that we knew about. And we used to keep track of when their deadlines were and what kinds of things they gave to and what their geographic region was, is kind of not necessarily that you were going to apply to them this year, but that to just know what the universe of funders were. Because of the internet now, that's probably an obsolete tool, because first of all, their deadlines change often, their giving priorities change often. So using the internet to find that information in an up-to-date fashion is usually the best way to go. So any questions about all of the handouts we gave you, all the tools? Oh, Beth put a something in the chat about a discount for grant stations. So thank you for that. So we showed you this last time. This is another pretty important thing to check when you're looking at a particular funder. If you're looking at doing a capital campaign to build a building or buy a long-lasting asset, you need to make sure that the funder you're looking at actually funds capital. And usually they will use this language, and that's why I keep mentioning it over and over again. Do they fund just programs? Do they fund programs in capital? Do they fund capacity building and general operating? Sometimes it'll just be one, sometimes it'll be all four, but typically it's just one or two types of programs that they fund, depending on what they want, what kind of a foundation they want to be. And the reason I mention this is that we're getting ready to break up for a small discussion and do some grant research on your own. And I want to make sure that that you're clear about these definitions. So a program supports a specific activity or group of activities. Capital, we already discussed. Capacity building helps make you a better organization by investing in training or infrastructure or humans that make you better. And then general operating is the blank check that you can use for whatever you happen to need. Any questions about these definitions?
Jennifer, I have a question. Just to clarify, when you say people power, that is FTE, or is that consulting dollars?
It can be either. So for example, if you need someone to do board development, you could hire a consultant to do board development, or you could send all the people on your board to a training class about board development. Also, capacity building, a popular grant is the hiring of a development director or development staff to help you with fundraising. And the hope is if a grant pays for that person for a year, by the time that year is up, they will have their feet under them and be able to continue to raise money for the organization in a way where the grant is no longer needed. Does that make sense?
Yes. So it's usually, if it's going to be for people, it's going to be just a starter grant, and then you have to have a sustainability plan.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's true of most grants.
Things. Yes.
It's a sustainability plan,
right.
as we know.
It's hard to find the people funded grants. So that's good to know.
Yeah. In our region, the best capacity building funder I know is Murdoch Charitable Trust. If you're looking for a capacity building grant, we happen to have one at RDI right now. They do 3-year grants for a person where they pay 100% for them the first year, 66% the second, and 33% the third. Their application is a bit daunting, but for a 3-year grant, it probably should be. So any other questions on these definitions?
Does a capacity building grant pay for salaries like for a director?
Yes. If that is what you need. So for example, if you're an all volunteer group right now and what you really need is staff and you want to hire an executive director, that would be a capacity building grant. But as Kimberly said, just remember that you're going to have to explain to them how that person is going to be funded after the grant is over. And so you'll have to think about what the plan is for that.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? I see there are chats.
Jennifer, can I say something? You mentioned the Murdoch grant and how it's a 3-year just declining grant. Our experience with some of our funders is if they are daunting applications, definitely go for multi-year funding and not 1 year. You've done all of the work to put that in, build a 3-year budget, not a 1-year budget, so that you can show where you're kind of trying to get your people to, or your funders to exit, and what your strategy is, so that but then you get that long time funding too.
Yeah, it's nice. A lot of not all funders will do multi-year grants, but they are, I agree with Beth, they are a gift because of the time that it takes to write these proposals. I totally agree. Okay. So this is what we're going to do. This breakout is a little bit different than the ones that we've had in the past. We are going to assign each small group a funder and give you some minutes to do your Google research and figure out what their geographic region is, what their giving priorities are, what kinds of things they fund, what are their timelines. You may not get to all of these questions during that time. But what we'd like to do when we all come into the big room is for many of you to sort of share what you learned as a way for all of us to share information and learn about some of these funders. Additionally, after we finish the breakout, if there are other funders that we haven't covered and you want to make sure to get them in the virtual room, we welcome to have you. We're welcome your you sharing those. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words. Okay, so this particular breakout takes a little bit more Freya finesse, sorry, because we have to do, and I think I'll let Freya explain it, but I think the name of your funder will show up in the title of your breakout group once you get sent over there. Is that right, Freya?
Yes, so everyone will go into a breakout room that's titled with the funder that you'll be researching. When you join the room, you should see that name, but if you don't, you can just look up in the corner of your browser. If you look up top left in your browser where it says Zoom meeting, that's where it'll have the title of your breakout as well. All right, I will open the rooms now. Everyone who's told me that they can't participate will be going in a non-participating breakout.
Okay, everybody, are we back? And now we feel full of knowledge about different funders. I'd love to have us go around and share what you've learned for the benefit of the full group. Who had Reeser Family Foundation? Does somebody from that group want to share what they've learned?
I did.
Okay.
We found out that they have two granting programs, one under 12.5K and one between, I can't remember the other one, but it was bigger. They have two application deadlines, February 1st and August 1st. They had an interesting one where it said they won't fund new programs, which I thought was, I don't know what that, I haven't seen that before. So maybe we can talk about what that means. Like if we were going to go for an executive director or something, and would that be a new program?
I think you're right. I had not seen that before either. So it's probably something that you would have to clarify with the program officer.
Right.
I do want to mention that there is a special grant program they have that's just for rural outside of their regular grant making. It's called the Small Community Initiative. Did you guys happen to see that while you were looking?
Yeah, that was the 12.5K one. And it was pretty open. They also only fund in Oregon.
Yes.
And they only give to nonprofits, established nonprofits that are older than 3 years old. So a new nonprofit can't really apply to Reeser.
Yeah, and it is hard to be a new nonprofit and apply it to funders. Honestly, they want to see that you have some bit of a track record, but it's not impossible. I will say, I think the Small Communities Initiative is separate from the two programs that you mentioned. That is a $10,000 a year grant for 4 consecutive years. And what they do, and the reason we wanted to mention that first is because they're asking us to tell you all about it. And so I thought we would put it on the list. It's due, Freya's at the end of this month, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's a cool program that they're doing just for rural communities. They pick a rural community every year, and then that community gets $10,000 a year for 4 years, and they essentially do community development work with it. It's kind of, they work with us pretty closely to stand up that program. And so we want to make sure we shout it out. Thank you.
I was also in that room, and I wanted to let everybody know that Oregon Humanities is having a conversation with fundraisers today from 2:30 in the afternoon to 5:30 at the High Desert Music Hall in Redmond, Oregon. So there's a chance to meet and greet funders.
That's great. I'm glad
people live in the area.
Yes, that's great. They also have a grant called Public Program Grants. If you're in arts and humanities, I think the max is out at $10,000. It happens to be due Monday. If anybody's got their act together and wants to apply for that. So thanks for bringing Oregon Humanities into the room. That's a great suggestion. Does anybody have Oregon Community Foundation and want to share anything about them?
I was part of that group. I had a really hard time hearing, I will say. It was really muffled when I was on the Zoom with her, with the gal, with Leslie. What I did, she was on the website looking at it, and I had my handy book that's outdated, but we bought it for my school this year just to have it. So I was looking at my book, and her organization had actually had a little bit of, I think they were a part of it was, they had something that was a project that was funded with them. But so Oregon Community Foundation, hence Oregon, they only fund in Oregon. It sounds like, it seems like a very massive foundation. My understanding, and this is via Leslie, and I'm not going to articulate it well, so please forgive me, everybody, but it sounds like it's where if I'm an organization or if I'm a private person or something where I might want to give money to an organization, and then the organization then will make those decisions and kind of have to do all the work behind, deciding who's going to be getting that money. I don't know if I articulated that right, but that's kind of my takeaway. And then she mentioned that there were 2 funding cycles, one in the spring and I think one in the fall with different focuses. And that is about it for my takeaway.
No, that's fine. That's a great start. So what I will tell you is that they recently got a new CEO and they've retooled their grant making a little bit. Just to build on what you said, yes, they have 2 cycles. We just missed one, but I would look out for it in 2024, which is it's a general operating grant for small nonprofits. So I'm guessing that applies to a lot of you. Freya during the break looked up the deadline and it was March 6th. So we've missed it for this year, but look at it for next year. And then, yeah.
I'm on their website now. The March 6th is when the LOI opened. March 20th is the LOI closing. So there's still
okay.
a little bit of time for that spring. I got on a different computer, so hopefully the mic is better.
Oh, it's way better.
Okay.
Way better.
Because the spring cycle is specifically around general operating support.
Right. And so thank you for clarifying that. So if you can pull an application together by Monday, more power to you. And I think, Leslie, what's the budget limit for the size of the organization? Can you see that?
Yeah,
It's Oregon, by the way, somebody asked which foundation we're talking about. It's called Oregon Community Foundation.
It's 250,000.
Okay. So if your annual budget is under 250,000, you are eligible by March 20th to apply for a general operating grant. And looks like Freya put it in the chat. So their general community grants program is going to open up in the fall, and that's a little bit wider. It's wider open. There's no budget limit, and they have a number of things they fund. And then as was mentioned, there is it Margit?
Margit.
Thank you. I was going to butcher it. Thank you, Margit. As Margit mentioned, they also have something called donor advised funds, which is actually a really interesting thing, which basically means you apply for a regular community grant and it doesn't get funded through the community grants program as part of their process. But somebody out in donor advised fund land says, hey, I'd like to fund that. So we've gotten in a situation, for example, where we've written a grant, been declined, and then 2 weeks later get a letter that says the donor advised fund wants to fund it for the full amount. So don't lose hope. And also they have this thing called an organization profile tool in Oregon Community Foundation's website. And what that basically is you can fill out once a year, go in there and say, this is who we are. This is who our executive director is. This is the kinds of programs we fund. And that is what they will, that's like their searchable database for their donor advised funds. So I would definitely recommend doing that. Faith, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, Jennifer, I just want to clarify that what's due on March 20th is a letter of inquiry only. It's not the grant application, and it's pretty extensive. So if you want, these grants don't come along very often. So you still have time, but it's going to be super competitive. Yeah,
I think Oregon Community Foundation is probably one of the more well-known foundations in Oregon. So whatever you do there is going to be competitive, but it doesn't mean you still may want to put in an application if you think you can meet the guidelines that they're saying. Let's move on to something that's not in Oregon for a minute. Does anybody want to talk about Murdoch a little bit more? I know we already did some discussion earlier in the session about Murdoch.
I had Murdoch with 2 other folks, so if they chime in, that's where they're from too. Murdoch works in Alaska, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest. It includes, but it just kind of specified. They had 5 categories that they talked about supporting. That included arts and culture, human services, health, education, and scientific research. And they broke those down into more specific types as well. Some of their other specifics that we found interesting was that they do a lot of stuff for research universities or anything with biomedical interests, as well as they do granting for faith-based internships, which is just kind of unique in the world here. They do capital funding as well. And we weren't able to find a timeline, but we found an amazing grantee roadmap that shows like every single step and what to expect. And if this happens, do this, which was really cool.
Thank you. That was what I was going to say too. Was that their website is a great primer for how to write a grant. If you're just looking for resources, it doesn't even have to be for Murdoch. Essentially, they have done an excellent job on their website of providing things that will help you write a grant in your life. So if you're looking for that, I recommend looking at that. So I'm glad you guys found that too. What about, I think I saw in the chat something about Collins. Does somebody want to talk about them?
I can talk about Collins, but I think she actually just had an experience with them. So what my experience with Collins has been, they're very heavily focused on forwarding DEI in the projects and organizations that they work with. So they want to see not necessarily established DEI, but definitely progressing towards DEI within your organization. And they have an LOI process and an that turns into an invited application process to continue. Their most recent deadline was February 1st, and they don't have any additional upcoming dates listed on their website.
It used to be quarterly, but they also, maybe they're revamping that.
Just this year they changed it. Just this year they went to, I think this was their year of like revisiting their strategic plan and like policies and that sort of thing. So I've followed them a lot. We've done two applications with Collins and been declined both times, which is really frustrating because it's a big process. So we went down a rabbit hole in our group. We didn't necessarily look for all of the stuff that you told us to look for, which was why I put that link in the chat.
That's fine. You can talk about whatever you want.
That link answers all the questions that were in the
that's fine.
thing.
What was your rabbit hole about?
Our rabbit hole was when we're looking at LOIs, they're all different. And so, somebody was saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do for an LOI. Do I just write one letter? Do I do one thing? And the consensus is it's different for everybody. So really having a strong understanding, like your case for support kind of thing, or your case statement, under that first stuff that we've gone through in this class of understanding what you're needing and how you're going to get there and all of the pieces that fit together, so that everybody who's applying for grants in your organization, because not everybody has somebody paid to do that. Some of you are volunteers that, you're scrapping by and trying to make it happen. Everybody needs to kind of have that same voice. So if you're going off of a really tight document that you've all worked on together and know what the purpose is, that's going to help articulate what you're trying to do with all of the different grants that you're applying for.
Mm-hmm. Truth. Thanks, Beth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the important thing to know about Collins, as Beth said, is first of all, they've also, like Oregon Community Foundation, become more competitive, I think, through the pandemic, and that they're very focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and helping organizations move forward in that capacity. Who had the Oregon Main Street Revitalization Program?
That would be myself and Kim and Megan. And so, first of all, every time I look at Megan, I get cold. So we were going to write a grant to get her a heater. And then more about the Main Street Revitalization Grant is It's put out from, first of all, it's only allowed in Oregon. It's put out from the State Historic Preservation Office. It's funded from lottery funds, Oregon lottery funds. Its purpose is to acquire, rehab, and construct buildings on designated downtown areas and main streets. 50% of their funds go to rural areas outside of the Portland metro area. Their maximum grant award is $200,000. It's a 30% match on that. And they do hold back 10% of the funds until all work is complete. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Their application timeline deadline is March 15th. And to be eligible, you have to be in the Oregon Main Street Network. It's typically cities, I think, would probably be the ones. I guess chambers of commerce could be going for that as well. But you're often going to be basically fixing up privately owned buildings. Most of the time, I think, is what looks like their projects are. So I don't know if there's any other further information I can provide for you on that, but we did
No,
find
that
a
sounds great.
really nice, Megan actually found this really nice kind of grant form. Their 2022 guidelines is what it was. And it had everything you could need on it.
That's great. Yep, the Oregon Main Street program, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, basically you have an organization in your community that is affiliated with the Main Street program. Sometimes they have a downtown association, sometimes it's called a Main Street organization, sometimes it is affiliated with the Chamber of Commerce or the city. But that's sort of the gateway into these. And there's more programs that Oregon Main Street provides than just this one. That's just their main capital one. So thank you, Matt. So getting out of Oregon for a minute, who had Wells Fargo? And you want to share what you learned about that?
I was in that group and we found a little bit of information, but it was kind of a tricky one. I feel like they have two separate things. So they have a more national one that seemed like it was for larger organizations that are doing bigger work, I guess, more widespread work. And then they have community grants for organizations in their communities, but they didn't do a very good job of describing what the area that those communities are. So,
so what
they had their specific areas that they looked to fund in, and I don't remember those right off the top of my head, but there were 4 separate areas that they were looking at. So,
oh, that's great.
They were financial health, housing affordability, small business growth, and sustainability and environmental justice. That's what they like to fund.
Perfect. So as I mentioned before, usually you're going to have a local connection to the branch. And in the case of Wells Fargo, they will actually give you an invitation code and they will give you a link. So in other words, you have to have special access to the special password to get access to their system. So they'll give you, like Kyla noted, basic information about what kinds of things they like to fund and where they like to fund. And essentially you just need to have a branch in your community. If you don't have a Wells Fargo in your community, then this is not going to be the grant for you. But there may be other banks that you can follow through with and have this conversation and ask if they have community giving. There is a thing, if you haven't heard of it before, called the Community Reinvestment Act that requires banks to give in their community. So every bank is going to have something. The question is how big their pot of money is. Like Kylan said, Wells Fargo is a humongous national bank. So they do huge national giving, but they also do community level giving. RDI has applied for one national grant and it was a bear, but and we're resoundingly declined. But we do regularly receive funding from Wells Fargo on the community level. So they're a good funder, and so are a lot of the other banks. But I would say my best bit of advice, if you're not familiar with funding from banks, is to start in the fall building the relationship, because what happens is they'll get their pot of money in January and they'll spend through it till it's gone. Does that make sense? And so if you can establish a relationship with them in the fall and say, we have a project, we think you might be a good fit based on the kinds of things you like to give to, and then say, and then reapproach them in January and say, you know, are you amenable to an application? Is, you know, what's the process by which we can apply? And if they say yes, then the nice thing is if they say yes, you're pretty likely to get money after you apply, if that makes sense. In other words, they've segmented a part of their budget for you because they said yes. Let's see what else we got. Oregon Transportation Growth Management. Did somebody research that one? Okay, maybe not.
Yes, we did.
Oh, okay. There he is. Hi, Kyle.
Sorry. Hey, I ran into Beth at a chamber meeting. She said I've been too quiet on this call, so I figured I'd speak up here. So yeah, we researched that one. We did find a little bit of info. It looks like their date to turn in your initial letter is the end of this month, the 31st. And then if you're like in an urban growth boundary, if you are along a rural highway corridor or in an urban unincorporated community, which I don't really know what that means, then you're eligible to apply. And we couldn't quite figure out if this was a project or if it was to be able to pay like a contractor to create the plan. So that we weren't quite sure on, but that's about what we've got out of it.
Great. So what I appreciate that, and that's essentially the gist of it. The reason we put the Transportation Growth Management Grant in this virtual room is because it's a really good way to get planning dollars to do things, to do like beautification projects, which are often things that people want to do. So Transportation Growth Management is through the Oregon Department of Transportation. So it's an ODOT grant, but it basically allows you to apply for what's also on the side of the road. Does that make sense? So in other words, yes, you can do some planning to improve a particular roadway, but you can also do some planning to improve what's on the side of the road, which is, you know, a lot of our cities and towns and other things that projects that we might want to do, sidewalks, street lights, landscaping, things like that. The other nice thing about Transportation Growth Management grants is they're pretty quick turnaround and they're pretty small, and whereas most state transportation grants are huge endeavors. So it's nice to have this as just a way to get started on something, if that makes sense. So thanks everybody for doing that exercise. I want to mention a couple that we were planning to introduce in the room, but didn't get a group to do, which includes Roundhouse Foundation, which I want to mention specifically because they're a rural funder in Oregon. They were concentrated mostly in Eastern Oregon, but lately they've had more of a statewide presence. So that would be one to look at, their website, if you're interested. And then, as we mentioned earlier, Pacific Power, if you are in a Pacific Power territory, if that is one of your utility providers, they have a good grant program, small grant program for communities. I will say that what was I going to say? It's really important. What funder was I just talking about? I completely lost my train of thought. Oh, Pacific Power. Oh, they have quarterly, thank you, Jennifer. They have quarterly deadlines, but each quarter has different emphasis. So there's like an arts and culture quarter, there's a community engagement quarter, there's you know what I mean? So you not only have to know what the deadline is, you have to know which deadline your organization matches to. So take a look at that. Beth, did you have a comment?
Of course I do. It's a Roundhouse. You just mentioned Roundhouse. I just had the most wonderful discovery call with them yesterday. We had never engaged with them before. Unfortunately, their deadline was yesterday at 11:59 p.m. But they have another cycle coming up in the fall. And I would highly recommend reaching out and talking with one of their program associates before you apply with them, because the gal I talked with was very knowledgeable about best programs or fits for requests and that sort of thing. And she was very open to having conversations as well. So her name was Dawn, and she was great.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. Anyway, so I feel like they're sort of expanding, and so they might be interesting to some people in this room. And I think that is all the one. Oh, Inovia Foundation, for those of you who are in Eastern Washington and Northern Idaho, is a kind of the equivalent to Oregon Community Foundation up in that part of the world. So if that's where you are, take a look at Inovia Foundation. Are there any other ones that we haven't mentioned that you guys would like to share before we move on? Okay, if you think of one, if you think of some, you can put them in the chat. I am going to theoretically, I'm going to share my screen, except of course now my computer is locked up. So here's what I'm going to talk about next. I'll show you the slide eventually. We're going to talk about unsolicited proposals. So when you look at the funding databases that you talked about, like the book that we saw, the Oregon Foundation Center book, and the websites that have grant research, you're going to see a lot of small family foundations that say we do not accept unsolicited proposals. And what that means is, and this is upwards of 75% of the foundations out there in the world, that just means they don't have a grant making process. They don't want to hear from you because they have an idea of what they want to give to, and they do their own sort of internal thing about who they want to give money to, and they want to be left alone about it. I'm saying that in a dramatic way. It's not the whole story. So the question is, how closed is the door? In other words, if you come across a family foundation and you're like, this is in my geographic region, they're funding the kind of work I do, I know they would be interested in us. How do you handle that situation? You could, if there's an email address or a telephone number provided in the foundation database, you could try to reach out to them and say that. And essentially what I would do if I was in your shoes is say, I think that our work matches your giving priorities. Can we request a meeting to discuss it? You're not going to be asking them for money. You're just initiating a relationship, if that makes sense. And the other thing that you can do that's a little bit more passive is you could, if you have an email, add that email to your newsletter distribution list so that they start receiving information about your organization. So that's something to think about as well. One thing I would say, and this is just a Jennifer opinion, you may feel differently, is because funders often get inundated with requests. If you get a no, or if you don't hear from them despite all of your efforts, I wouldn't necessarily be super persistent, because you can annoy funders pretty quickly. If you think about the number of people who are asking them for funds, just be a little bit careful about the idea that you're building a relationship and that you want to foster a relationship as opposed to just relentlessly bombarding them with requests to meet or requests for funding, if that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit more. I think Beth mentioned with respect to Roundhouse Foundations that there's a lot of different ways to cultivate relationships with funders. So we were just talking about funders that don't solicit applications. So let's pivot back to those that do, and those that do have a grant making program. If it feels intimidating to kind of launch into this and get to know a foundation and connect with them, I would use Beth as an example. Usually most program officers that you reach out to are pretty awesome humans, and will talk to you about what they do, and we'll talk to you about whether or not your organization is a good fit. But I would check their website. Essentially, if they say, please contact a program officer before you apply, then I would obviously highly recommend that you do that. And I think it saves you a lot of time, because if you're not a fit, then you don't have, then you can stop continuing down that road. There's nothing, well, I'm again hyperbole here, but thinking about writing a full proposal cold when you have absolutely no idea whether or not they'll accept it is a lot of work that will make you sad in the end. Does that make sense? So the more that you can be assured that they're interested, the better you'll feel about putting the time in that it takes to write a proposal. So for example, when we talked about Wells Fargo, if you know that you're likely going to get funded before you submit the proposal, that's a lot better place to be in. And the way that you can get there is to get to know these foundations, to connect with a program officer about your idea. The thing that I would say that you should pay special attention to is program officers review hundreds of proposals every year, right? So they're going to have really strong ideas about what works when you're applying to their organization. So any little bits of knowledge that they give you about you need to make this part of your proposal stronger, or you need to develop this idea a little bit further before you come to us. Pay attention to what they say, because they are the ones that submit the funding proposals that they want to move forward to their board for approval. Okay. So after you submit the proposal, there's this thing particularly for larger grants called a site visit. It used to be that people did those in person. Now they're, sometimes they're virtual now, but they want to come and see your organization, see how you work, meet with your clients, meet with your board members. And so think about how you might organize that meeting. I have included as part of the initial email, we worked with Research Family Foundation to come up with a little primer for Research about how to do a site visit. And they created a really nice slide about that. So I sent that along to you as well, so you could read how to prepare for a site visit. It's a nice little handout that you can use as you wish. And then the other thing I would say is, let's say you submit a proposal, you get your funding. First of all, celebrate, yay, because it's awesome. But then think about how you're going to continue to maintain that relationship. So the old adage about when you're doing fundraising, don't just reach out to funders or to donors to ask them for money. Develop a relationship that you continue throughout the year. So if you have an event that they're helping to fund, invite them to the event. If you're doing a class, like if you're doing this grant writing class and Ford is funding it, I always invite Ford. I'm like, come and join us for a session if you want to. And they always come at the end for the funder panel. But we also have sessions we do in, trainings we do in community, and the funder will sometimes show up just to see what we're doing. And they love being a part of that. So make sure that you're continuing to maintain the relationship so that when you get to the end of the grant and you write your really cool report that says that you did all this awesome stuff with their money, then you're in a really great position to apply for something else. Or maybe if it's the right kind of foundation, continued funding for the same project. Does anybody have any questions about funder relationships? The other thing I will say here is that there's sort of a fine line about how to be prepared for program officer calls. So like Beth mentioned, she had a great meeting with Roundhouse Foundation, and they had a conversation about what Amani Center does and what Roundhouse Foundation funds, and they found where their points of connection were, and it was really great. I wouldn't necessarily call a foundation without being able to have that conversation in a pretty sophisticated way. Does that make sense? And maybe, there are other people in the room that can speak to this. In other words, I wouldn't call and say, I'm thinking about doing this, but I haven't done any work around it. I don't have a budget. I don't know what the project is exactly. I don't have any partners yet. I think that you're going to want to have a pretty well-developed idea before you call your program officer, just to, first of all, establish that you're a legitimate, capable organization, but also because they'll be better able to give you direction if you've already sort of started down a path and you have some ideas, but you just have questions for them, like, would you fund this? Would you consider funding this? Because they're not going to be able to say yes or no over the phone, but will you consider funding this? What do you think would strengthen our proposal? What kinds of partners do you think would be helpful besides the ones we already have? Things like that.
Sorry.
Okay, any other questions or comments on this one? Okay, we're going to move on to partnerships. So when we talk about partnerships, we're talking about like organizations, either within your community or within the sector of service you provide, and how this can help you build a stronger organization and write better grant proposals. So I think a lot of these things that you see on the screen here that are the benefit of partnerships are pretty common sense, but just so that we get them in the room, partnering with other organizations allows you to share expenses and resources. It helps you reach new populations. You can share ideas with one another to make both of your organizations better. There's this great thing about reducing redundancy. We always talk about the fact that there's 5 organizations doing the same thing. How can we work together and find our lanes and be more effective? The community benefits from those kind of relationships, and it also helps you sometimes fill funding gaps or service gaps. So before we launch into a new partnership, sometimes organizations get nervous about this because there's this sort of territorial aspect of relationships with organizations like yours sometimes, because you're competing, it feels like you're competing for funding or resources, or if you're looking at the same client population, you're competing for participants. I guess what I'd like to encourage you to do is sort of shift your mindset a little bit and think about the fact that if you partnered instead of competed, that it might develop, you might end up with a better project altogether. So in small communities, there's this, I think, a tendency that we all know each other pretty well. You know, you go to the grocery store and you see 10 people you know, and it's obviously true when you work in a particular sector of the community, whether that be social services or the arts or Main Street, that everybody knows who all the players are. So you sort of have this, you're already sort of informally partners because you see each other on a regular basis, et cetera, et cetera. What I want to encourage you to do is do a little bit of planning to maybe put some meat on the bones and make them a little bit more formalized if you're talking about getting together for writing grant proposals. And the reason for that is, first of all, it's a benefit to maybe define this a little bit better than something that's informal. But secondly, you are going to be asked to describe this partnership in a way that makes it sound like it's a going concern, that it has been organized in a way where everybody understands their roles, and the funder will want to see that you have done this work, if that makes sense. So the kinds of things you can do when you're planning for partnerships are think about what the problem is that you're trying to solve and how you can work together to solve it, create the details of who, what, where, when, and why. If you are going to be spending money, agree on a budget and which pieces of the budget each organization is responsible for, checking in often on progress, and then which basically speaks to stewarding the relationship, which is making sure that there's ongoing communication, and so people know what pieces they're responsible for and holding each other accountable. And then obviously celebrating the successes is really important. Sometimes we can be partners with an organization for years, but we forget this step where we're getting together to say, look at what we accomplished together. Isn't this cool? So we're going to break out into a small group to talk about partnerships. But before we do that, I just want to get the creative juices flowing a little bit and describe some different types of ways you can partner as a way for you to think about who you might reach out to. So it may be that you're looking for new partners, but it may be that you have some sort of loose relationships with people that you want to make something into something that's more concrete. So there's this idea of referral partners, which are organizations that refer clients to one another's services. So if you have a free clinic and a community pharmacy, the clinic would refer to the pharmacy. If you have a homeless shelter and a food pantry, the homeless shelter would refer to the food pantry. So that's a referral partner. There's program delivery partners whose staff work together to operate the program or part of a program. Like if there's a mobile healthcare clinic in your community, there are churches and community centers that allow it to park in the parking lot and market services to the particular populations that that's hitting. Work for hire, one partner engages the services or expertise of another. So if there is a partner that does financial education, they may pay someone else to use a particular curriculum that they've developed because they think it would work really well for their organization. Operational partners, this is probably one that most of you are familiar with or have heard about, where one partner owns the space or the land or the equipment, and another uses that land or space to deliver their programs. So a school owns the building that a local food bank operates in, or the city owns the land that a local sports nonprofit uses for games and practices. There are advocacy and coalition partners. So this gets into more about public policy where, you know, this is the idea that there's power in numbers. So if you're trying to change a policy at local or state government level, pulling together into a coalition will help you be more effective. So for example, the homeless shelter and the food pantry are both part of a local state sustainable foods coalition that advocates to the state capital to help improve local food system delivery. And then the last one is kind of a funny buzzword called thought partners that maybe you've heard about, and this is very informal, but I think it has tremendous emotional support value, which is if there are people in your community that are all working towards the same type of goals, whether it's in the arts or whatever sector, getting together for coffee every once in a while just to tell war stories, exchange ideas, not only just makes you feel better that you're not alone in the world in the programs that you're providing, but it also sometimes is the way to generate some really fun ideas for projects or programs or ways to work together to do great things for your community. Whew, I feel like I've been talking a lot today. The next breakout that we're going to do, a small group discussion, is, as you can see on your screen, there's some sectors, these circles of sectors. So in community development work, these are sort of the typically identified dimensions of a rural community. So think about when you look at these different sectors where your organization would fit. Are you an arts and culture organization? Are you in public safety? Are you in economy building? Where does your organization fit? So the way we're going to do these small group discussions is you're going to pick which one of these quote unquote rooms you want to be in. So if you want to talk about health and human services, pick that. So you're going to pick your own this time. What we'd like you to do in the room is think about who you're currently working with, and maybe you talk about that. Think about who you might work with to either increase your reach or provide better programs. And the reason we do this in a small group discussion is because you know the sector, or you guys are interested in knowing more about the sector, and there's opportunity for a lot of give and take and to share ideas. So that's why we're doing it this way. Any questions?
I do. I'm working with the senior center. And I don't know whether we want to reopen a thrift store that got closed with COVID. And so I don't know whether that'd be under economy or human services.
Well, you could start with human services, and then if you don't feel like that's the conversation you want to have, then you are always welcome, by the way, we probably should have mentioned this earlier, to jump out of your breakout and have us reassign you somewhere else. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and then the other thing I will say is, and Freya probably will explain this better, but if we end up with one person or nobody in a particular group, we may ask you if you want to join a different group just to have the conversation. So Freya, I'll let you explain more and take it from here.
Sure, so this one will be a little bit different where you get to choose your own room. So when I open the rooms, most of you will see the option to join the variety of sectors, the 6 different rooms on your screen. It doesn't pop up for everyone, so if it doesn't pop up for you, just hang tight and I can get you placed in the room of your choice. And then there will be a room for non-participating folks too. So if you're able to choose that and you just aren't able to have your camera on or participate in the breakout, just go ahead in that room, or you can hang tight in the main room with us. All right, I will open the main room. I will open up the rooms now and just hang tight if you don't see the option to select one. So folks are starting to join rooms. If you didn't see the option pop up to join a room, if you want to just unmute and let me know which room you'd like to go into, or you can just put it in the chat which room you'd like to go into.
I didn't get in, and I'd like to go into art and culture.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Ken. If I could get into the natural resources.
Great.
This is Megan. I'd also like to get into the natural resources and environment room.
This is Connie. I'd like to get into the economy room.
Great. Anyone else? We've got Matt going into natural resources. Anyone else in the main room at the moment that?
All right, I think we're welcoming everybody back from their small group discussion. Is there anyone who wants to share a question or a epiphany that they had as part of their conversations about possible partnerships or ways to make the current partnerships they have better?
For the last 15 minutes, I've been researching the soil and water conservation district for our county. And two other members of our group mentioned that they're working with them as well in their respective counties. So it's sounds like I'm on the right track.
That's terrific. Sometimes you just need to have the conversation, right? That's funny.
Very true.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I was surprised because I'm writing a grant to reopen our the senior center thrift store. I never thought we have a sheltering Silverton place that they might be able to come in and volunteer to learn retail skills.
Oh my gosh, that's great.
And I never would have thought about that.
Oh, this is inspiring. You guys are awesome. Anybody else?
I'll share. I had not given the thought, the whole idea of collaborative grants. I mean, I'm a charter school, and I know there's someone in our partnering district who, probably does this all the time. And I was like, no, I would never ever think to reach out and even ask. I mean, they can say no, but I never even thought about asking, because it's like, I just think of how hard it is to write grants and how much time it takes. Why in the world would they want to, share some of their time with my school?
But if there's something you can work on together, plus you both have the same goal, right? You're trying to educate. So
exactly.
Makes sense. Anybody else? Oh, and Matt found a website from the Nonprofit Association of Oregon that has funding opportunities, so that's good.
I'd love to see that website again if we could.
Yep, we'll put it in our post email. Freya's going to make a list of all the links that we've been sharing in the chat, so we'll add that one too.
Perfect, thank you.
So I am having some internet issues today.
Am I on?
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, we had a good conversation about just partnerships, like with existing, like Head Start, if you're interested in early education, but the problem with workforce, and if there are people for your organization or what your vision is, and to make sure that that's compatible with your visioning, and perhaps to look at who exactly in your community is willing to work and willing to show up.
That's great. No, I think workforce development is a great partnership that probably we don't think of. It's a little outside of most of our nonprofit work, but it's a great opportunity. That's a wonderful suggestion. The other thing I'll mention is that we, in your packet of handouts today, have provided 2 templates for you. One is a sample memorandum of understanding. So particularly if you need to formalize roles and budgets and things that are concrete, that is a template that you can use to do that. You can also call Kristen and she can kind of walk you through those steps if you want to have a 30-minute meeting with her. We did put the link, or Freya's going to put the link in the chat to the 30-minute meeting interest form, because I know some people mentioned they've been having trouble seeing it in the email, so we'll throw it in the chat as well so you can access it that way. And we'll put it again in our post email as well. The other template I have in the packet is a letter of support. So what often happens when you're writing a proposal, sometimes the funder will require it or allow you to do letters of support, and that's a way for your partners to, it's not as formal as an MOU, but it's a way for your partners to explain why they support your organization and how you guys have been partnering together just in a 1-page letter. So that template just gives you some ideas of ways that you could format that. So this is just a gut check slide about partnerships, some things to think about. We all know that what the benefits can be, but there's also some resources that are going to have to be expended by your organization to do this. So make sure as you're considering proceeding with either strengthening or a new partnership that you have the capacity to give this partner the attention they need, like if you have time to do this, and if the time is going to be time well spent for you in terms of improving your organization or the services you provide, what additional expense and staff time, it's going to be additional staff time, but it might be worth it. And this is more about standing up the partnership too. There's going to be a lot of sunk cost involved at the beginning, but then the maintenance might not be as big of a deal. And then the last one that we want to mention that particularly applies to small communities or small nonprofits is, as we all know, the nonprofit that has like the amazing charismatic leader, or the person that's in charge of a nonprofit that does basically all of the jobs of the nonprofit, you know what I mean? And so just something to think about is, do you feel like your relationship is with one person, or is it with the organization and could withstand a change in leadership? So those are just some maybe things to mull over as you're considering this topic. Faith, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, I really like the last bullet point, and I want to just stress that if you think you're just working with one person, it might be a good idea to request a meeting with the board, formal meeting to present your proposal that you've been talking with the board member and you want to move forward with it and get the support of the board.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Thanks, Faith. Anything else on this slide that anybody wants to say or comment on? Oh, there's a nice thing in the chat from Christine about community lunches. Oh, I love it. That's great. Thank you, Christine. So, as we talked about in the sessions 1 and 2, we have a project charter that we're working on, or a case statement that we created a summary statement for our project. We've created a budget, and now you have the opportunity to consider and list potential funding sources and potential partners. So that's what we talked about today relative to your project charter, if you're working on that. And then this is the check-in about the common elements that you will see in most grant proposals. The things we talked about today is they're going to ask you who your partners are, and they're going to ask you to define that relationship. So your ability to do that will help strengthen your proposal. The service area of your organization or project is important because it has to match the service area of the funder. So that is something we hopefully clarified today. When you're defining the need or the impact, we're going to delve into that a little bit more next week, but you want to be able to tie your need for this project and what you think the impact of this project will be to their giving priorities. There has to be a connection between their giving priorities and what you're doing, and that's super important. I will say, when I write a grant proposal, that's always my last step, is I go back and make sure that that their giving priorities are somehow mentioned and addressed as part of the proposal. And then also we talked about activity. We can tie what we talked about today to the activities and the implementation of the project relative to what the partner roles will be, and whether this helps you, for example, increase the population that you serve, things like that. Okay, is there anything anyone wants to share beyond what they've already talked about relative to what new knowledge or skills they're feeling good about today, or one thing they think they might consider doing differently to improve their organization or their ability to get funding? Okay.
Well, I'll share something because something happened yesterday. And as much as I think we're sharing with those in our inner circles the needs we have, there's always more sharing to be done. We run a women in business group over 3 counties, and funding for that is something that's been a concern. And, there was a call that came in yesterday that said that they shared with the a regional group and they heard what we're doing and they're going to fund us for 2024. So it's
Oh,
like, what?
wow.
I was getting ready to think, oh, do we form a nonprofit? What do we do? You know, because when funding runs out, it's so tricky. But I thought, how have you not reached out? Like, I do have a list of partners that I share events with. Like, they're the people I've seen their retinas and I know they're going to share with the people they know. So I have this nice list, and it never occurred to me to say, you know, I don't know, it just feels a little vulnerable to say, hey, we need more money. And it's not that much, and it's not like a formal grant process we're even going to go through. They just want to know more about what we're doing, and they already have discretionary dollars. And so it's just one of those things where I think as many people as you tell, keep telling more people, you know, because I hadn't shared it with our internal group yet because it just happened, for one thing. But it wasn't even 2 days after I shared with our the organizing team that call, she was talking to that person in that call, and I get 5 immediate texts saying, call me right now. And so it's exciting, but I thought, you know, I work with these people, you know, you got to think further, and I guess let yourself be a little vulnerable.
No, that's a really good point. I think that sometimes it's hard, even though a lot of us have been in fundraising for a while, sometimes it still feels hard to make the ask. And I think that one tactic, like Kim said, is you just have to keep mentioning things and saying, you know, and it doesn't have to sound needy. It can sound like, we have this program and we're, you know, we want to keep it moving forward. Is there somebody we can partner with that can help us keep it moving forward? And the other thing is, if you have a regular newsletter, you can think about having a what do we need section that you just update every month, or however often you send out your newsletter, that says, you know, seeking funding for, and have dollar amounts attached to that. Anything else? Oh, I'm glad you guys are talking about networking in the chat too. It's, as Kim just mentioned, it pays many benefits. So the other thing we want to mention to you as part of this session is RDI has this Facebook group called the Pacific Northwest Rural Action Facebook group. If you're interested, that is when we hear about grant opportunities, other resources like legislation that has funding attached to it, et cetera, we usually put it in that Facebook group. So if you wanted to join us, you can receive those notices. In addition, in our monthly newsletter, if you're not getting it already, we also do a resource roundup where we put a few grant opportunities coming up in the as part of a regular installment in that newsletter. So you can do that as well. We also, for those of you who are interested, have just started a Facebook group in Spanish. So if you know of anyone who would be interested in that, we have that as well. So if you think about the funding gaps you identified as part of your budget process in session 2, hopefully now you have an idea of the process by which you could look for funding sources to meet those gaps. Also, you can review your list of potential partners that you've talked about today and think about the next steps that you can take in the next 30 days to move those forward. One thing I will say about next week's session, it's more about the nuts and bolts of grants. So the different sections, we're going to just dive into a little bit more detail. And it's also the last session where we're sort of in this format where we, we discuss topics, we have a lot of give and take. And so if there's anything that you feel like we haven't hit on that you want to make sure that we cover next week, you can tell me right now, or you can put it in the chat, or you can send me an email, and I'll make sure that we usually have a little bit more time in the 4th session to address things that haven't been covered yet in a little bit more detail. And that could also be that there's something that I've introduced briefly that you just want more detail about. So if there's any topics like that, just let me know and we'll cover that next time. Because our 5th session is the Meet the Funder session. So that's more focused on their presentations and asking them questions. So it's less about our cohort here having a conversation, if that makes sense. Okay, so next week, same bat time, same bat channel. And we are honored to have Ford Family Foundation and Sherwood Trust as our helpers in financially supporting this endeavor. It is 11:52. I am happy to stay on and answer questions or just chat, or if you need to run away and get 7 minutes back in your day, you're welcome to do that as well.